All-Share Index, as you know, was the best performing stock index in 2020, rising over 50%. Of course, you know, a number of factors contributed to that. Very low, record low yields at the Nigerian fixed income market. Kayode, what should we expect this year? Looking at the All-Share Index, it's already at 41,000 points already this year. And I'm looking at the insurance sector and oil and gas sector, the best performing so far. So that's sort of an indicator of where investors want to put their money, at least in the short term. But what do you make of this?
I think it's a good start to the year. I think you have various different things that encourage investors. One is the insurance sector, the capitalization requirements. I think that will come to this summer to increase capitalization. So there's a lot of interest from investors in the insurance sector. Oil and gas, there's a PID, which we promised the National Assembly will be passed before the end of Q1, potentially beginning of Q2. So that's benefited to that market. And then you also have one big thing is where the Naira is, because especially for a lot of foreign investors who come back into the market, they have to be sure that if they do bring in dollars to buy local stocks, they can take their dividends and take their money out on a basis. And I think the CBN can continue the process of trying to show that there's enough dollars in the market and the stability in the FX market that will help. But for local investors, given where the fixed income market is, it makes sense to invest, especially in blue chip local equities.
Now, apart from the oil and gas sector, we'll talk about that if we have some time. For the other companies, obviously, they're still going to be operating in a weak macro environment, particularly the banks. There are still macro and asset quality concerns for the banks going into the year. But what do you think investors will be focusing on the macro side of things, and also perhaps also monetary policy, this regulatory environment, how this is going to impact the banks on one hand, and on the fiscal side for the companies themselves, having a better or friendlier business environment to support them, loans from the banks, or maybe, I don't know, some grants from the federal government into those sectors where these companies operate?
I think one plus point is that the 2021 budget was passed early, was passed before the end of last year. So it started the 1st of January, which was good. So people could see where the budget and what the budget, what concentrations there were in the budget, and also the Finance Act. And the Finance Act, which is a new development, which we've had the first one last year. I think there's a second Finance Act and various tax reforms that have been pushed through that. I think that's helped in the process and helped investors try and lay the field quite early on what the government is trying to do. The CBN announced a lot of interventions in particular sectors, especially in the agricultural sector, and also in terms of supporting banks to try and provide more credit to the private sector. I think those will continue in that process. I think people are hoping that some of the reforms, the massive macro reforms we need to see in the economy, will be pushed through. I mean, there's been talk about selling government assets, there's been talk about reducing government takes in joint ventures, trying to raise capital. The transportation infrastructure is being upgraded. The new terminal for Motor Mohammed so it's coming to play before the end of this month. You have Lagos-Ibadan, which started trial runs, which is basically nearly complete. Just need to do the Spurs at Papa, you have the Warri Tape line. So, and then you have various road projects across the country, which are going to improve transportation. So I think everyone wants to see how that's going to affect, especially things like inflationary pressure. We have inflation of over 15%, which is quite large, and see whether there's going to be now the borders are also open officially, to see whether they're now going a downward movement in inflation and also improvement in some of those fiscal things.
Okay, let me squeeze one last question for the oil and gas sector. Obviously, the sector is benefiting from higher oil prices, and the Senate President has said that the lawmakers will prioritize passing the petroleum industry bill this year. Just your thoughts on how your forecast for this sector this year and the kind of gains that we could see.
I think it's very important that PRB is passed as soon as possible. If we can get PRB passed by March, April, I think that's going to be very good for the sector. It's also very important that we look at what's happening with OPEC Plus and caps on production. Nigeria is capped at, without the concept, at 1.5, which is going to reduce their output ability of a lot of the oil and gas companies. So that's something to look out for. And also how the banks treat a lot of, especially the local non-IOC oil companies. I mean, they have a lot of debt, which reduce revenues, that force them to try and restructure, and then a lot of them have not been able to service it. So hopefully, the banks will continue to work with those companies to try and improve that. But I think the oil sector, as long as PID is passed, and I think the oil sector is looking up, and you're seeing interest in the oil sector. Some locals are still buying assets from the IOCs, which shows there's still strong interest in that sector.
Kayode, thank you so much for talking to us today. And of course, the pleasure is always having you as our guest host today. Thank you very much, Kayode Akindele, partner at TRA Capital.